The diesel engine roared to life at 3:47 a.m., its 1,500 horsepower splitting the suburban silence like thunder. Martha Chen pressed her face against her neighbor's window, watching in disbelief as her 17-year-old son Marcus maneuvered a 70-ton M1 Abrams tank down Maple Street, the same street where 12 hours earlier, corrupt city officials had illegally demolished their family home while they slept. The tank's massive treads crushed the private property. No tree spacing, signs that still littered their front yard, and as Marcus rotated the turret towards City Hall, Martha realized her quiet, honorable son had just declared war on the most powerful people in town. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus had discovered something in the rubble of their destroyed home that would expose a conspiracy reaching all the way to the state capital. The sound hit Martha Chen like a physical blow, the grinding, mechanical roar of heavy machinery that shouldn't exist at midnight in their quiet suburban neighborhood. She jolted awake in the cramped motel bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to orient herself in the unfamiliar darkness. "Mom." Marcus's voice came from the other bed, thick with sleep and confusion. "What's that noise?" Martha was already fumbling for her phone, her fingers shaking as she pulled up the security app connected to their home's cameras. The screen blazed to life, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. 3 massive bulldozers surrounded their house, their beautiful 2-story colonial with the blue shutters and the garden she'd spent 10 years perfecting. Yellow construction lights flooded the property in harsh, surgical brightness, and men in hard hats moved around the machines like worker ants. The lead bulldozer's blade was already biting into the front porch, splintering the wooden pillars Martha's late husband had installed with his own hands. No, Martha screamed, scrambling out of bed so fast she nearly fell. "I can't do this. The injunction doesn't expire until Friday." Marcus sat up, instantly alert despite being jarred from sleep. At 17, he had his father's sharp eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, but right now his face held the raw confusion of a child watching his world collapse. "Mom, what's happening?" "They're destroying our house." Martha's voice cracked as she watched the blade tear through the front door. "Those bastards are actually doing it." She was already pulling on clothes, her mind racing through legal precedents and emergency injunctions, and every phone number she'd memorized over the past 3 months of fighting this nightmare. The city had claimed eminent domain, saying they needed the land for a new municipal complex. But Martha knew better. She'd done her research. She'd followed the money. This was about Councilman Bradley Thorne's construction company getting a sweetheart deal, and her modest house was just collateral damage in his march toward a bigger profit margin. "Get dressed," she told Marcus, grabbing her purse and keys. "We have to stop them." "Mom, it's midnight. Who are we going to call?" "I don't know, but I'm not going to sit here and watch them steal everything we have left." They'd been living in the Sunset Motel for 2 weeks, ever since the first demolition notice appeared on their door. Martha's lawyer had assured her that legal challenges would buy them time, but apparently Thorne's people had decided to cut through the red tape with bulldozer blades. The drive from the motel to their house took 8 minutes that felt like hours. Martha's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, while Marcus sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring at the orange glow on the horizon that marked their neighborhood. "There's our house," Marcus said quietly, as they turned onto Maple Street. Except it wasn't their house anymore. It was rubble. The bulldozers had moved with shocking efficiency. The entire structure had been reduced to a mountain of broken wood, twisted metal, and shattered memories. Martha's grandmother's china cabinet, which had survived the journey from Taiwan 50 years ago, lay in fragments beneath a pile of roof shingles. The piano where Marcus had practiced for 8 years was nothing but a tangle of wires and splintered keys. Martha parked at the police barricade and stumbled out of the car, her legs barely supporting her weight. A dozen workers were loading debris into dump trucks, working with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. Off to the side, a small group of city officials stood around a folding table, drinking coffee from thermoses as if they were watching a football game instead of destroying someone's life. "Stop," Martha screamed, running toward the barricade. "You can't do this. I have an injunction." A police officer stepped into her path, his hand resting casually on his belt. Officer Rodriguez. She knew him from the neighborhood association meetings. His kids had played with Marcus when they were younger. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Chen Rodriguez said, and he actually did look sorry. "I have orders to keep the area clear." "Orders from who?" "This is illegal, Rodriguez. I have papers." The demolition order was signed by Judge Carmichael at 11:30 p.m., Rodriguez said. "Emergency provision. Something about structural instability." Martha felt the world tilt sideways. "Structural instability? That's impossible. We had an inspection last month. The house was solid." "I'm just following orders, ma'am." Behind the barricade, Councilman Bradley Thorne emerged from the group of officials, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the midnight hour. He wore a designer overcoat that probably cost more than Martha made in a month, and his smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Chen," Thorne called out, walking toward the barricade with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "I'm sorry you had to see this. We tried to reach you, but you're lying." Martha's voice was deadly quiet. You didn't try to reach anyone. You scheduled this for midnight because you knew I'd tried to stop you. Thorne's smile never wavered. Now, Mrs. Chen, I understand you're upset, but the city has followed all proper procedures. The structural report clearly indicated what— Structural report, Martha demanded. I never saw any structural report. Filed at 11:15 p.m. tonight, Thorne said smoothly. Emergency situation. Inspector Martinez found critical foundation issues that made the building an immediate public safety hazard. Martha turned to look at her son, expecting to see the same devastation she felt carved into his features. Instead, Marcus was staring at the demolition site with an expression she'd never seen before. His jaw was set, his hands clenched into fists, and his eyes held a cold calculation that made her think of his father in his marine dress blues. Mom, Marcus said quietly, never taking his eyes off the wreckage. Dad's workshop, Martha followed, his gaze to what had been the garage. Her husband's workshop, the place where he'd restored vintage motorcycles and taught Marcus everything about engines and hydraulics and the 100 small miracles that made machines work. The place where he'd kept his military memorabilia, including photos from his deployment to Iraq and the Bronze Star he'd never talked about. The workshop's gone, Marcus said, his voice still eerily calm. Everything Dad built, everything he left us. I know, honey, I know. Martha reached for her son's shoulder, but he stepped away from her touch. They didn't just take our house, Marcus continued, his voice getting harder with each word. They took him again. Thorne was still talking, something about compensation, and municipal development and the greater good. But Martha had stopped listening. She was watching her son, and what she saw there made her stomach clench with fear. Marcus walked back to their car without saying another word. Martha followed, her mind reeling as she tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. They'd lost everything, not just the house, but 17 years of memories, family heirlooms, and the last physical connection to her husband. We'll fight this, she said as they got back in the car. We'll sue them into the ground. Whoop. No. Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless. We won't. What do you mean? Marcus was staring out the window at the demolition site, where the dump trucks were already hauling away the remains of their life. Fighting in court takes years, Mom, and they've got judges in their pocket too. Saw how fast they got that. Emergency order. The system isn't going to save us. Then what are we supposed to do? Marcus turned to look at her, and Martha saw something in her son's eyes that made her blood run cold. It was the same look her husband had worn when he'd enlisted after 9/11, the look of a man who'd decided that some things were worth dying for. We're going to remind them who they're dealing with, Marcus said quietly. Martha wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone stopped her. Instead, she started the car and drove them back to the motel, where they sat in silence for the rest of the night, watching the orange glow on the horizon slowly fade to gray dawn. At 6 a.m., Marcus got up and showered. At 6:30, he put on his ROTC uniform, the dress blues his father had been so proud of when Marcus made honor roll in the junior program. At 7 a.m., he kissed his mother's forehead and told her he loved her. At 7:15, he walked out of the motel room and didn't come back. Martha spent the day calling everyone she could think of, lawyers, journalists, civil rights organizations, anyone who might listen to a story about municipal corruption and illegal demolitions. Most of them were sympathetic but useless. The few who showed real interest wanted documentation. The first police cruiser arrived within 90 seconds, its sirens wailing through the pre-dawn darkness as Officer Rodriguez skidded to a stop behind Martha's car. 2 more patrol cars followed, their occupants spilling out with drawn weapons that looked absurdly inadequate against 70 tons of armored steel. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez muttered, staring up at the tank's massive bulk. Is that kid actually? That's my son, Martha said, getting out of her car with her hands raised. And yes, he's actually sitting in a goddamn tank. The tank's engine idled with a deep, throaty rumble that Martha felt in her bones. Marcus remained motionless in the commander's hatch, his face carved from stone as more emergency vehicles converged on Maple Street. Fire trucks, ambulances, even a SWAT van, the entire city's emergency response apparatus mobilizing against one 17-year-old boy with access to military hardware. Mrs. Chen, Rodriguez approached cautiously, his service weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. I need you to talk to your son. Tell him to shut down that machine and come out with his hands up. And then what? Martha's voice was hoarse from crying, but her anger burned bright and clear. You arrest him for defending his property. You charge him with terrorism for standing up to the people who robbed us. Ma'am, he's pointing a tank cannon at City Hall. That's not defending property, that's threatening to level a government building. Martha looked up at her son, still in the tank's turret. Maybe that's exactly what this city deserves. The external speakers crackled to life, and Marcus's voice echoed across the neighborhood with mechanical amplification. I want to speak to Judge Carmichael, Councilman Thorne, and Mayor Westfield. You have 10 minutes. Kid's got balls. One of the SWAT officers muttered. Kid's got a death wish, Rodriguez replied grimly, but Martha was studying her son's posture, the way he held himself in the commander's position. David had taught both of them about military vehicles during their weekend trips to air shows in military museums. She knew enough to recognize that Marcus wasn't just sitting in the tank, he was operating it with the confidence of someone who understood every system. "How the hell did he get that thing?" Rodriguez asked, echoing Martha's thoughts. The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Sarah Mitchell of the National Guard jogged up to the police line, her uniform hastily thrown on, and her face grim with professional concern. "That's one of ours," Mitchell announced without preamble. "Stolen from the armory 3 hours ago. Security footage shows your boy driving it right through the front gate." "That's impossible," Rodriguez said. "Those things require specialized training." "The boy's father was David Chen," Mitchell interrupted. "Staff Sergeant, 2nd Tank Battalion, died in Fallujah driving one of these machines. Word is, he'd been teaching his kid about armor since he could walk." Martha felt her heart clench. Of course, David's weekend projects hadn't just been about bonding with his son, they'd been about passing down knowledge. The endless hours in the garage, teaching Marcus about hydraulics and drive systems and engine maintenance, the military documentaries they'd watched together, the stories David had told about his deployment, always focusing on the technical aspects rather than the violence. Her husband had been preparing their son for war, and she'd never even realized it. "Mrs. Chen," a new voice called out. Martha turned to see Mayor Patricia Westfield approaching the barricade, flanked by 2 bodyguards and looking like she'd been dragged out of bed. "I need you to talk to your son. This situation has gone far enough." "Has it?" Martha's voice was arctic. "Because from where I'm standing, it's just getting started." Westfield was a small woman with silver hair and the kind of political smile that never touched her eyes. She'd been mayor for 12 years, winning re-election by comfortable margins, while the city's infrastructure crumbled and neighborhoods like Martha's got bulldozed for development deals. "Your son is committing multiple felonies," Westfield said. "Theft of military property, threatening government officials, destruction of public property." "What public property?" Martha demanded. "The only destruction I've seen tonight was done by your people." "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're upset about the demolition, but proper procedures were followed." "Bullshit." The voice came from the tank's speakers, and every head turned toward Marcus. "Mayor Westfield, you've got 8 minutes to get Judge Carmichael and Councilman Thorne down here, or I start making some property improvements of my own." To emphasize his point, Marcus rotated the tank's turret 30 degrees to the left, the massive gun barrel swinging toward the newly constructed municipal parking garage. The hydraulic whine was audible over the engine noise, a mechanical threat that needed no translation. Westfield paled. "You can't be serious." 7 minutes and 30 seconds. Marcus announced. Martha watched the mayor's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally calculation. Westfield pulled out her phone and made 2 quick calls. Her voice too low to overhear, but her body language screaming urgency. While they waited, more officials arrived. The fire chief, the police chief, even a representative from the county sheriff's office. They set up a command post behind the police cars, talking in urgent whispers and occasionally gesturing toward the tank, like it was a dangerous animal that might charge at any moment. "Ma'am," Captain Mitchell approached Martha again. "I need to ask, do you have any idea how your son accessed our armory?" Martha thought about lying, but the truth was going to come out anyway. "His father's friend, Tommy Nakamura. He works for the county recorder's office, but he's also a Marine reservist. He had access." Mitchell nodded grimly. "The same man who's currently in intensive care at County General. You know about that?" "We know about a lot of things, Mrs. Chen, including the fact that someone tried to kill Mr. Nakamura last night, probably because he'd been investigating irregularities in property transfers involving city officials." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. "You're investigating the corruption? Federal task force has been building a case for 6 months, Mitchell said quietly. "Your house was just the tip of the iceberg, but your son may have just blown our entire operation." Before Martha could respond, a black sedan pulled up to the police line. Judge Harold Carmichael emerged from the passenger side, his judicial robes hastily thrown over pajamas. He was a thin man in his 60s, with the kind of perpetually disapproving expression that came from decades of looking down at people from behind a bench. Councilman Thorne arrived 30 seconds later, in a gleaming Mercedes, his silver hair still perfectly styled, despite the 4 a.m. hour. He strode toward the command post with the confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't buy his way out of. 5 minutes, Marcus announced through the speakers. "This is insane," Carmichael said, staring up at the tank. "We can't negotiate with terrorists." "He's not a terrorist," Martha snapped. "He's a kid whose life you destroyed for profit." Mrs. Chen Thorne stepped forward with his political smile firmly in place. "I understand your son is upset, but surely we can resolve this like civilized people." The tank's main gun rotated, to point directly at Thorne, the massive barrel stopping just short of the police barricade. The movement was so smooth and precise that it seemed choreographed, like a death ballet performed by 70 tons of steel. Councilman Thorne Marcus's amplified voice carried across the street. "Tell everyone here about Clearwater Development, LLC." Thorne's smile faltered. I don't know what you're talking about. Clearwater Development, Marcus repeated. Shell company registered to Judge Carmichael's wife. The same company that's been buying up properties condemned by the city for emergency demolition. The same company that's planning to build luxury condos on the land where our house used to stand. Martha saw Thorne and Carmichael exchange a quick glance, and she knew her son was right. The conspiracy was real, and somehow Marcus had proof. That's ridiculous, Carmichael said, but his voice lacked conviction. I don't know anything about liar. The tank's engine revved a mechanical roar that cut through the night like thunder. I have bank records, property transfers, email, correspondence. Everything Tommy found before you tried to kill him. Nobody tried to kill anyone, Mayor Westfield interjected. But she was looking at Thorne and Carmichael with suspicion now. These are serious accusations, serious enough that the FBI has been investigating for months, Captain Mitchell said quietly, and serious enough that Mr. Nakamura nearly died trying to expose the truth. The command post erupted and whispered, arguments. Martha could see the power structure fracturing in real time as officials tried to distance themselves from the corruption scandal that was unfolding in front of them. 2 minutes, Marcus announced. What do you want? Thorne, finally, asked, his political composure cracking. Manya, we can discuss compensation. I want justice, Marcus replied. I want you to admit what you did to my family. I want you to return the land you stole, and I want everyone responsible to face consequences. That's not how the legal system works, son, Judge Carmichael said, attempting to regain control of the situation, even if these allegations had merit, which they don't. You can't hold a city hostage. The tank lurched forward 6 feet, its treads grinding against the asphalt as it rolled over the police barricade like it was made of paper. Officers scatter. Federal agents, stand down. The command came from behind the FBI cordon, delivered in a voice that carried absolute authority. Agent Kowalski spun around, her hand moving toward her weapon, but froze when she saw who had spoken. Colonel James Harrison emerged from the darkness like an avenging angel, his army dress uniform immaculate despite the early hour. Behind him came a full platoon of military police, their weapons trained not on Marcus, but on the federal agents surrounding the tank. Colonel Harrison, Kowalski said, her political smile slipping back into place. This is a federal operation. You have no jurisdiction. Wrong. Harrison's voice could have cut steel. That's a military vehicle stolen from a federal armory, which makes this a military matter. Stand down your agents, or I'll have them arrested for interfering with a Department of Defense investigation. Martha stared at the colonel. Recognition dawning. She'd seen his face before, in photographs on David's desk. Harrison had been her husband's commanding officer in Iraq, the man who'd written the letter informing her that Staff Sergeant David Chen had died a hero's death while protecting his fellow Marines. Marcus Chen, Harrison called out, his voice carrying across the street. Exit the vehicle slowly with your hands visible. Marcus climbed out of the tank's commander's hatch, moving with careful precision. His ROTC uniform was wrinkled from hours inside the cramped vehicle, but he held himself with military bearing as he faced his father's former commanding officer. Sir, Marcus said, snapping to attention with parrot ground precision. At ease, son. Harrison's stern expression softened slightly. Your father would be proud of your tactical thinking, but concerned about your choice of targets. The targets chose themselves, sir. Harrison actually smiled at that. Fair point, Agent Kowalski. I'll need you and your team to return to federal jurisdiction. The boy and the evidence are now under military protection. You can't do this, Kowalski protested. We have a federal warrant issued by Judge Carmichael. Harrison's eyebrows rose. The same judge currently under investigation for corruption? I'm afraid that warrant carries about as much weight as a Confederate dollar. Martha watched the standoff between military and federal authority, her heart hammering as she realized how close Marcus had come to disappearing into federal custody, but something still didn't make sense. Colonel, she called out, stepping forward despite the weapons still pointed in various directions. How did you know to come here? Harrison turned toward her, and Martha saw genuine sadness in his eyes. Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry for your loss, both your husband and your home. To answer your question, Staff Sergeant Nakamura contacted me 6 hours ago from his hospital bed. Tommy called you. Your husband saved my life in Fallujah, Harrison said simply. When his son needed help, Tommy knew I'd come running. Agent Kowalski was speaking urgently into her radio, but Martha could see defeat in her posture. The federal agents were outnumbered and outgunned by military police who answered to a completely different chain of command. This isn't over, Kowalski said, backing toward her black sedan. You're interfering with a federal investigation? No, Harrison replied calmly. I'm conducting one. As the FBI agents retreated, Martha felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks, but her relief was short-lived. Marcus was still standing at attention beside the tank, and she could see the weight of everything he'd done settling on his 17-year-old shoulders. Colonel Harrison, Marcus said formally, I need to surrender myself for theft of military property. Negative, Harrison replied. The tank was checked out to you under emergency authorization. Marcus blinked in confusion. Sir, Staff Sergeant Nakamura is a Marine reservist with security clearance. When he reported credible threats against military families and requested emergency support, I authorized the release of necessary equipment for defensive purposes. Martha stared at the colonel in amazement. You gave him permission to take the tank? I gave him permission to defend his family, Harrison corrected. The specific methods were left to his discretion. It was a legal fiction so audacious that Martha almost laughed despite everything. Harrison was retroactively authorizing theft of military hardware by classifying it as a defensive operation against domestic terrorists. What about the evidence? Marcus asked, nodding toward the manila envelope still clutched in Agent Kowalski's retreating form. Already secured, Harrison said, producing an identical envelope from his coat. Tommy was smart enough to make multiple copies. We've been coordinating with legitimate federal investigators, not the compromised agents you just encountered. How do we know who to trust? Martha demanded. If Kowalski was compromised, how do we know there aren't others? Because the real investigation is being run out of Washington, not the local field office, Harrison explained. And because the evidence you've gathered doesn't just implicate local officials, connects to a federal conspiracy involving land seizures across 12 states. Martha felt the world tilt sideways again. 12 states. Councilman Thorne and Judge Carmichael are small fish, Harrison continued. They're part of a network that's been using eminent domain fraud to steal property from military families. Specifically, someone's been targeting the wives and children of deployed soldiers, betting that they won't have the resources to fight back. The implications hit Martha like a physical blow. David's deployment, her struggles as a single mother, the timing of the first demolition notice, arriving just days after the anniversary of David's death. None of it had been coincidence. They've been hunting us, she whispered. Yes, Harrison said grimly. But now we're hunting them. As if summoned by his words, a convoy of black SUVs appeared at the end of Maple Street. Martha tensed, expecting more federal agents, but Harrison looked satisfied rather than concerned. Right on time, he murmured. The lead vehicle stopped beside the tank, and Martha watched in astonishment as Secretary of Defense Patricia Morrison emerged from the passenger seat. Morrison was a small woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of presence that made four-star generals stand at attention. Colonel Harrison, Morrison said briskly. Status report. Operation successful, Madam Secretary. The Chen family is secure, and the evidence has been preserved. Morrison turned to study Marcus, who had snapped back to attention despite his obvious exhaustion. You're David Chen's boy. Yes, ma'am? Your father was a good Marine. Died, protecting his unit from an IED that would have killed 12 men. Morrison's voice carried the weight of personal knowledge. I signed his Bronze Star citation myself. Marcus's composure finally cracked slightly. Thank you, ma'am. Morrison nodded once, then turned to Martha. Mrs. Chen, I'm here to personally apologize for what's been done to your family. The targeting of military families is an attack on the entire Department of Defense, and we take that very seriously. What happens now? Martha asked. Now we finish what your son started, Morrison replied. The evidence you've provided will be used to dismantle a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of several state governments. Judge Carmichael and Councilman Thorne are already in federal custody. This time, Martha looked around at the scene that had developed on her old street. Military police securing the area, genuine federal agents processing evidence, and her son standing beside a tank like some kind of suburban warrior. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, rather than her actual life. What about our house? She asked quietly. Morrison exchanged a glance with Colonel Harrison. The emergency demolition order has been declared invalid. The city will be required to rebuild your home to original specifications, plus damages for the illegal seizure. And if they refuse? Morrison smiled, and Martha was reminded that this woman had spent 30 years climbing through military hierarchy. Mrs. Chen, do you know what happens when local governments refuse to comply with federal court orders backed by the Department of Defense? Martha shook her head. They discover that federal infrastructure funding is surprisingly fragile. Morrison said, roads need repairs, bridges require inspections, and sometimes federal agencies decide that certain cities no longer meet safety standards for various programs. It was political hardball played at the highest level, and Martha found herself impressed despite her exhaustion. You're going to economically pressure them into compliance. I'm going to make it more expensive to fight us than to fix what they broke, Morrison corrected. And I'm going to make sure every mayor, councilman, and judge in the country understands that military families are off limits. As the secretary spoke, Martha noticed movement in the houses around them. Porch lights were coming on, and neighbors were emerging to see what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2 houses down, the Patels from across the street, even cranky old Mr. Henderson who usually complained about noise. They weren't just curious, they were supportive. Martha could see it in their faces. The way they looked at Marcus standing beside the tank. He wasn't a criminal or a terrorist to them. He was the kid who'd mowed their lawns and shoveled their driveways. The boy who'd grown up without a father and watched his mother work herself to exhaustion trying to keep their house. He was there. neighbor, and he'd done what none of them had been brave.